If you've spent any time on social media in recent years, there's a good chance you've come across one of these humanoid creatures, draped in tie-dye clothing that ironically costs more than your rent, and covered with enough facial piercings to send airport metal detectors into a schizophrenic episode. These individuals routinely create videos that consist of incoherent rants, ranging from topics such as the ability to heal various infections through self-love, alien-related conspiracy theories, and of course, detaching yourself from physical possessions, all filmed from within an expensive caravan or 6-bedroom quote-unquote hippie pad with a balcony and a hot tub. The presence of these figures online isn't exactly surprising. To put it lightly, social media and society as a whole is well and truly cooked, with over-the-top South Park-esque figureheads inserting themselves into each and every subculture, political stance, or hobby, with these particular individuals utilizing the visual aesthetic and overall vibe of the hippie subculture birthed in the 60s. If you were to look at this and immediately avert your gaze towards this, it's pretty easy to see a clear degeneration in purpose and meaning behind the subculture, with what's left of the aesthetic and ideology being commodified into Halloween costumes or overly expensive hippie clothing targeted towards people who think they can heal a kidney infection through self-love. Although social media seems to be brimming with these type of hippie social influencers, the example that seems to characterize the modern downfall of hippie culture the most is Shannon Blake. This self-proclaimed hippie Barbie boasts over 1 million followers on various social medias and has recently become a millionaire primarily through her music and innate ability to sell cheaply made products to children. The common consensus on Shannon Blake seems to split right down the middle, with one side labeling themselves shroomies and praising her ability to spread misinformation online through song, aka people with an underdeveloped frontal lobe, and the other side viciously criticizing her, labeling her a trustafarian and ironically still somehow spreading misinformation. A trustafarian is defined as a wealthy white person who adopts a lifestyle that incorporates elements from non-Western cultures, and is usually a label given to self-proclaimed hippies who just so happen to have rich parents. This label has been inherently connected to Shannon Blake, alongside the idea that her dad works for the aerospace company Lockheed Martin, suggesting much of her wealth came from her father. Although this backstory seems like the most likely parable when viewing this fucking thing, it isn't exactly true. Her father is actually a pilot and hasn't been in Shannon's life for 10 or so years. I fucking wonder why. Although it's understandable for the internet to try and discredit Shannon Blake by attempting to sift through her past, it's probably just a waste of time, as all you really need to do to criticize Shannon Blake is just listen to half of the dribble that comes out of her mouth. Shannon claims herself to be a Palladian starseed alien sent to Earth to spread peace, love, and yeast infection, it may seem. If you're understandably unaware of what the a Palladian is, it's a tool extraterrestrial that first saw documented contact with humans in the 1950s. This alien is said to have blue eyes, blonde hair, and white skin, most resembling a Nordic individual. This essentially means Shannon Blake claims herself to be an Aryan alien who apparently specializes in selling screen-printed sweatshop merchandise to a child audience. Although Shannon Blake's image suggests the promotion of handmade and sustainable products, her actual grift is quite the opposite. Instead of selling hand-knitted quilts, rocks wrapped in string, or some other hippie bollocks, she sells this generic Temu TikTok shop bullshit printed on a blank that was likely constructed by a 13-year-old Indonesian child that gets paid 2 grains of rice per completed sweatshirt. Although there's nothing wrong with selling cheaply made merchandise,
Coolia.store, Coolia.store, Coolia.store.
it's clear that Shannon's entire grift is based on insincerity, ego, and probably way too many psychedelic experiences. In a society where everyone is pretty much glued to a screen, whether it's by choice or for work, the idea of disconnecting from technology, getting in touch with your spiritual side, and reconnecting with nature is incredibly appealing, especially for a younger audience that likely has a fucking Vine as their first memory. Shannon preaches all of these things alongside a desire to live an off-the-grid nomadic nomadic lifestyle at some point in the future, although seems to continuously contradict herself through her lyricism and message. If you were to read the lyrics for any Shannon Blake song, what you'd find isn't too dissimilar from something written by generic trap artist number 47. The vast majority of subject matter focuses on Shannon flexing possessions, monetary wealth, or particular achievements that result in her receiving more possessions or monetary wealth, all sprinkled with the delusional spreading of schizophrenic conspiracy theories and bullshit wellness practices that can only come out the mouth of this 2CB gremlin. Shannon Blake seems to signify the inevitable trudge from counterculture towards capitalism. Anything that becomes appealing will eventually be grinded down into consumable paste and forced down our throats so a few more people can live in slightly bigger houses. Although perhaps the most popular, Shannon definitely isn't the only culprit. All over social media you see individuals that may resemble a typical hippie or dress in what you may see as stereotypical hippie clothing, dancing and spreading self-love from the inside of what are quite clearly mansions. It seems the hippie aesthetic no longer links itself with self-sustaining, nature-loving individuals, as most real off-grid social media influencers online look like this as opposed to this. It seems now more than ever, 60 years removed from the golden age of the hippies, the subculture is for the rich and wealthy as opposed to young and passionate. Although maybe the subculture still has hope through various physical safe havens for hippie culture, one example being Burning Man. There's no way a week-long festival in the desert with activities focused on community, art and self-expression is going to be infiltrated by the richest people on the planet. Yeah, disregard everything I just said and replace it with quite literally the opposite. The average attendee age for Burning Man is 37 years old, with most attendees spending over $1,000 for the experience. The most expensive accommodation within the festival reaches over $100,000. What was originally a traditional hippies paradise has essentially morphed into a Silicon Valley networking event, only with more LSD and less Adderall. Some of the most successful individuals on the planet flock to Burning Man every year. Examples include Mark Zuckerberg and Dustin Moskovitz, both known for starring in The Social Network, and of course Elon Musk, with countless academics, businessmen and entrepreneurs using Burning Man as an excuse to give into their depraved fantasies, surrounded by Instagram models who get panic attacks whenever they stray too far away from a plug socket to charge their phone. Through the naked eye, this may seem like a complete oxymoron. Billionaires invading a hippie festival to exercise gluttonous greed, overconsumption and hedonism, although it's not actually too far removed from what the hippies were all about back in the 60s. It all makes sense when we look upon what generation made up the vast majority of the hippies. Once again, it's the fault of the goddamn boomers. The 1960s truly marked the coming together of politics and counterculture on a huge scale throughout the United States. The rise of the hippies came hand in hand with mass-scale protests, with various groups fighting against the Vietnam War, as well as countless examples of discrimination within American society. Despite the fact that the various anti-Vietnam groups, civil rights protesters, and hippies were all fighting for a similar thing, these groups had very different backstories. Many of the anti-war protesters were older individuals who had either fought in the war previously or actively dodged the draft back in 1955. Civil rights protesters obviously consisted mainly of African American individuals who had become tired of discrimination and racial segregation, fighting for equality years before the blossoming of the hippie subculture and seeing many key members essentially murdered. Other groups such as feminists, Chicanos and LGBT protesters were seeing a similar level of discrimination. In comparison, the majority of the hippies consisted of middle-class students who had dropped out of university to become a part of the countercultural movement. Their ability to attend protests, organize peaceful festivals, and use nudity as a form of defiance was only possible due to their inherent wealth. They were actually able to afford to do so without working, whilst poorer people actually had to work. It's clear to anyone with a fully developed frontal lobe that the hippies of the 60s had a much smaller stake in the ongoing protests as the marginalized groups fighting for their freedom. The civil rights groups were fighting for their ability to fully participate in society, whilst the hippies were choosing to drop out of society and purposely not participate due to anti-establishment tendencies. The hippies were continuously able to cause huge disruption to American sensibilities through events such as the Summer of Love, with hundreds of thousands of people flocking to a small area within San Francisco to partake in primarily illegal activity with little pushback, whilst that same summer was seeing nationwide riots after a black taxi driver was wrongfully beaten by the police. Many of these riots resulted in double-digit deaths and triple-digit injuries, all whilst the hippie movement was essentially imploding within Haight-Ashbury. Much like in the modern day with social media figures representing the extreme of every subculture or opinion, the hippies of the 60s represented the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of counterculture, definitely the most easily recognizable, but less impactful in terms of political change. It's undeniable that their protest efforts were able to cause real changes in terms of acceptance of marginalized groups alongside anti-war efforts, although I believe it's safe to say the hippies' ability to cause change was more cultural as opposed to political, with political change primarily being thanks to the groups fighting directly against it before the hippies formed and after they imploded. Culturally, the hippie message spread. The typical hippie dress code, hair, music, and way of life was adopted by the establishment and morphed into a mainstream trend utilized to make money, which is pretty much exactly what Shannon Blake is doing in the modern day, utilizing the trend and movements that began in the 60s to make money. It seems the vast majority of cultural and technological innovation sparked on by the hippies has inevitably skidded its way towards capitalism. It's not a coincidence that prior to COVID teaching tech companies how cheap and convenient working from home is, the vast majority of large-scale tech companies were situated conveniently close to the epicenter of hippie culture within Silicon Valley, San Francisco. It's strange to picture the idea that a subculture obsessed with dirt, nature, and overly bright clothing would lead to technological innovation that eventually changed modern life as we know it. And it's even stranger to imagine that it's perhaps all thanks to this little piece of mind-altering paper and its relation to counterculture within the 60s. Before LSD was primarily used to make people either incredibly happy or incredibly frightened at the sight of quite literally nothing, it was being used by scientists and intellectuals throughout various experiments and trials in the early 60s. A 4-year study starting in 1961 aimed to dose 450 people with LSD in order to test its efforts on research and product development. This study involved various individuals key to the development of the computer and technology surrounding it, including the inventor of the computer mouse Douglas Engelbart and the founder of the Whole Earth catalog Stuart Brand. Although the Whole Earth catalog sounds like a new age TikTok conspiracy theory covered by slop channels, in reality it's a countercultural magazine published in 1968 that inspired much of the technological innovation that shaped our modern lives. The magazine consisted of various product reviews with an emphasis on an alternative and do-it-yourself attitude drenched in the hippie sentiment of the time. The magazine, that was quite clearly something that could only be thought up by somebody on copious amounts of LSD, would inspire eventual Apple founder Steve Jobs, who likened the magazine to a paperback Google years before Google was invented. Steve Jobs himself even subscribed to many of the early hippie ideologies, refusing to eat meat whilst attending investment meetings for Apple barefoot, at one point actually being kicked out because his feet stank so badly. If hippie culture was able to inspire anything, it was the idea that rules didn't apply, allowing individuals to break down the structures before them, creating products and services that may have been seen as impossible before. The hippie ideology inspired Jobs to look past the pursuit of financial gain, allowing him to take more risks and focus more so onto the product as opposed to potential profit. Without this sentiment, it's obvious that the eventual Apple would barely resemble what we actually got, reducing the popularity of personal computing within the modern day. So there we have it, barefoot hippie to tech bro to TikTok influencer pipeline, all wrapped up in a neat little package. When taking into account all these copied and pasted Wikipedia articles, the existence of figures such as Shannon Blake becomes a lot more understandable, although I do believe her existence is more a symptom of modern day social media as opposed to the development of hippie culture. Regardless of the financial status of the 60s hippies or the technological innovations some of them were able to achieve, individuals like Shannon Blake are inevitable. Any and every subculture, opinion or hobby is going to be infected with an overly eye-catching figurehead attempting to cash in on whatever they are essentially parodying. It's not hard to make a connection between millionaire hippies, upper-class punks like Youngblood, or even alpha male influencers that prey on disenfranchised men in order to make money off of online courses. They are all essentially doing the exact same thing, taking a certain image or lifestyle lifestyle that appears to be appealing to many individuals online and attempting to make money off the back of it. The continuous success of individuals like this not only proves how intrinsically split social media is, but the youth's innate desire to find purpose or relatability, and how individuals are bound to take advantage of it. In a terminally online world, instead of frolicking together in large fields, attending disastrous festivals, or falling for murderous cult leaders, the modern hippie is either subjected to being manipulated into buying cheap products online, or just being that fucking annoying individual online who's selling said cheap product. And to be fair, I can't actually decide which one is worse. At least Charles Manson did a funny dance.